Firstly, friends, it's always a great honour, great privilege to come to Leeds. One of my old housemates always ribs me because I've got this bad habit of milking, however tenuous, a local connection. And whenever I say I'm actually from Sheffield, I get a mix for sponsored Leeds. You all think I'm a plastic Yorkshireman now, so that's fine. It's a great honour and I'm humbled to be on this platform with these fantastic speakers. These are the key voices. These are the people on the ground who can talk from experience about the consequences of the policies being inflicted by this government on our communities and on our society. These are the voices that are almost always airbrushed out of existence by our political and media elite. So it's so important, one of our best weapons we have are voices like these who can talk about the reality. And in the struggle we have ahead, I hope we hear many more voices like that. Now I'm going to start by doing something that might surprise, maybe shock some of you, because I'm going to hand it to this government. I'm going to praise this government. I'm going to say this. They've set us a challenge. They've set us a challenge about how far they can push us, how far they can provoke us, how much they can attack us before we stand up and we say enough is enough, before we refuse to take it and before we push back. We just think through some of these provocations. Some of these attacks. The longest fall in living standards in this country since Queen Victoria sat on the throne. The driving of 1 million families a month into the arms of legal loan sharks. The 500,000 people who are now dependent on Britain's booming industry, food banks. This is the 7th richest country on earth. And apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest people. If we think of the selling of our National Health Service, to the private vultures who are circling overhead, by a government which did not even have the guts to put it to the British people. If we think of the slashing of support for working people and unemployed people, the humiliation and degrading experience of disabled people who are forced through the trauma of the national scandal that is Atos, their basic support stripped away, driving them into misery, despair and anguish. The bedroom tax, one of the most outrageous and unjust policies inflicted by a government on its own people for generations. 2/3 of those affected, of course, being disabled people. Whether it be the 1 million young people who are now without work, languishing in unemployment with a future of debt and insecurity. Whether it be the 5 million people now languishing on social housing waiting lists, the social cleansing of our inner cities, the 6.5 million people now looking for full-time work which simply doesn't exist, the 1 million people now dependent on so-called zero-hour contracts, returning us to the Victorian age when people would turn up at the dock, stand there, put their hands up, waiting to see if they could get any work that day. With such provocation, with such assault, of course, the response cannot be silence. And the government know this. No wonder then today they are pushing through Parliament the so-called lobbying bill, in reality a gagging bill, intended to silence charities, trade unions, campaigners, who are going to expose exactly what this government has done to our society and to our communities. One of the most audacious assaults on democracy in modern times. And of course, with such justified anger, with such justifiable frustration at the fact people are getting poorer week after week, month after month, year after year, no wonder this government has tried to redirect that anger away from those who plunge this country into its mess, those at the top, to people's neighbours down the streets. The working poor against the unemployed, non-disabled people against disabled people, private sector workers against public sector workers, those living here at the moment against immigrants. They say to the low-paid worker, who's in real terms, whose wages have been slashed, whose tax credits are being hit by this government, who do they want you to hate? They want you to hate the scrounger down the road. If you're a supermarket worker, or a call centre worker, or anyone in the private sector whose pension rights have been assaulted for over a decade? Who do they want you to turn your anger against? The nurse next door whose pension is still intact. And what else do we see? We see the sight of public money being splashed out on vans parading National Front slogans from the 1980s in an attempt to turn people. How low can this government get? Those are the realities. This is the attempt by this government, the age-old policy of divide and rule. And each time the argument's the same. We've mugged you, so why shouldn't we mug your less deserving neighbour as well? And that's where we come in. Because I'll be honest, and you all know it too, there's no shortage of anger out there. There's no shortage of fear. But there is one thing missing, and that's hope. And it was Harvey Milk, the crusading civil rights campaigner, who said in the 1970s, "I know you cannot live on hope alone, but without it life is not worth living." And the point is this: doesn't matter how angry people get, doesn't matter how scared they get, if they don't have hope, they don't fight back. They yell at the TV. The biggest party in this country, after all, is the yelling at the television every time George Osborne appears party. But they won't fight back unless they have hope, and that's where we come in. We've got to give people hope. And we do that by offering a coherent alternative. I just want to talk quickly about what those ideas are, and I've said this a million times, but our enemies hammer their message to death, and we've got to do the same as well. They tell us about social security spending is too high. Well, they've got a point. It has not to do with a bunch of lazy scroungers dribbling in mansions that are made out of widescreen television sets, watching Jeremy Kyle on repeat all day. It's a triple crisis. It's a housing crisis, it's the low wages crisis, and it's the jobs crisis. Now, taxpayers have every reason to be furious about the £24 billion being wasted on a housing benefit. That's not lining the pockets of the tenants. It's lining the pockets of private landlords charging extortionate rent. Let's be clear about our response. We say this: as well as controlling rents, let councils build housing to create jobs, stimulate the economy, bring down the housing benefit, low wages. Now, friends, tax credits are a lifeline for millions of people in this country, but again, let's be clear. They're a subsidy for low pay because bosses aren't paying their workers properly. Instead, we should be arguing for a living wage, so people's wages. Here's the jobs crisis. 6.5 million people, as I say, looking for full-time work that isn't there. So we should be calling for an industrial strategy like they have in Germany. Instead of having this dogma, the state doesn't intervene, the market picks winners or losers, we say let's create hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs, taking on the environmental crisis and taking on that jobs crisis as well. We talk about tax justice. Now, friends, we have that benefit for it every single day, and we know it exists. It's less than 1% of total social security spending. That's about £1.2 billion a year. Compare that to tax avoidance by the people at the top. £25 billion every single year, because those at the top have a smug army of lawyers and accountants for them to exploit every single loophole going. So we say this: change the law so it has one message, one clear message. No ifs, no buts. Pay your taxes. Finally, the banks. Reality is we nationalise the debt and privatise the profits. We, the people who bail them out, don't have control over what they do. So we should demand a public investment bank with those, us, the people who bailed them out, having democratic control of those banks to help rebuild our economy. And friends, I don't think this is wacky stuff. I don't think it's outside of the so-called mainstream or centre ground of British politics. These are policies which every poll going shows have widespread public support. And if we offer that coherent alternative, we can give people hope. And that's what the People's Assembly is all about doing. I mean, just think about it. It's a formidable coalition. It's a coalition of unions representing millions of private and public sector workers, of the Green Party, of Labour Party activists, of campaigners fighting for disabled people, young people, elderly people, and others. And in other times, I suppose we have a bit of a stereotype as a movement of falling out with each other over the smallest possible detail, the People's Front of Judea, and so on. I think some of you laugh more out of bitter experience than anything else. But the difference is this: we can't afford to fall out with each other anymore. We can't afford to quibble over minor details. Too much is at stake. And to be perfectly honest, if we screw this up, we will screw it up for a generation or more. We have a responsibility to get this right this time, not least given what's happening to people right across this country. Now friends, social change, if we think about it, how it happens, it doesn't happen because of the goodwill and generosity of those above. It happens through the struggle and sacrifice of those below. And it is not for us to casually discard and give away all the gains, all the rights that were won at such huge sacrifice. Now just quickly, just the sorts of things that give me hope, that show it is possible to fight back. Came to Leeds last year and I met with bin workers. Many of you will know this struggle far better than I, who went on strike in 2009 against the Lib Dem Tory coalition before that was all the rage. And they attempted to impose pay cuts of up to a third. And they went on strike for 9 weeks in a bitter struggle in winter, where people had to get up every day at 5 AM on freezing cold picket lines. And they won.
They didn't win.
Well,
Well,
they did win huge gains, and that is a proud victory. And if we don't acknowledge the gains that people win through struggle, we might as well just give up. And there were other great victories as well. The electricians who took on Balfour Beatty, a huge multinational company, they took them on through strikes and occupations, and they won. We talk about tax avoidance now. Everyone's talking about tax avoidance. Who was talking about it a few years ago? It languished on the fringes until UK Uncut came along and occupied banks and businesses owned by people who weren't paying their taxes. Everybody's talking about it now. And we think, of course, about the poll tax movement. Now, many of you will be looking at me thinking, oh, come on a minute, you probably weren't even born at the time. I was technically. The first demonstration I ever went on was I was 5. You think of precocious now, I started to chant, didn't I? But remember that. Thatcher had seen off even the miners, and people thought if even the miners can't win, then no one can win. And they took her on, not just through demos, but through peaceful civil disobedience. Millions, including my own parents, refusing to cough up and pay it. And they didn't just defeat the poll tax. They helped to boot Margaret Thatcher out of number 10 altogether. All of these examples of being possible to fight back. And another, just to wrap up, another favourite quote of mine was Frederick Douglass, an African-American statesman from the 19th century, a freed slave. And he said this: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." And that's the reality. It's only by all of us organising together from below, not treating politics as a soap opera at the top, but forcing gains from those with power. That is our lesson of our history. That's always how we've won. Now, just to quickly, before I finish, before we move on to the important bit of the discussion, some of the things we need to be doing as the People's Assembly. We've got this proposal now for Saturday for a National Day of Action to take on legal loan sharks. These are the parasites who exploit the biggest squeeze in living standards, as I say, in modern times. We need to be looking at what UK Uncut did and occupying these legal loan sharks in cities across the country. My understanding is such an action has been decided on here in Leeds, so hopefully we can hear more about that. There'll be those sorts of actions across the country. We've got, of course, the 29th of September, the Tory conference in the city I grew up in. I have to say, we're going to have to give them a very, very, very warm northern welcome when they enter that city. And of course, on the 5th of November, we're talking about a day of direct action right across the country. I just want to finish by saying this: there is hope. It often seems too overwhelming, too much of an assault, too many battles to be fought. But that's what makes it so powerful. There's so many of us, so many different struggles, so many attacks on so many different people. That if we link them together, we learn the lesson of the 80s and not be picked off one by one as Thatcher managed. We link those struggles together. And I have this absolute confidence. I say it every time because I believe it. That we stand together. We fight together. We will win this together. Thank you.